Hey everybody, so far in this unit, we've learned that the United States had a weak government under the Articles of Confederation. Now, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation government became pretty apparent to most after Shays' Rebellion in 1786. As a result, the states sent delegates to Philadelphia to revise or edit the Articles of Confederation. They decided, however, to instead throw away the Articles and start from scratch. We call this meeting of delegates the Constitutional Convention because of the plan of government they eventually wrote, the United States Constitution. That sounds like a great story, but, as we'll see, there was a little bit more to it than that. In fact, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention disagreed on many issues. In the next few minutes, we'll look at three major disagreements that occurred at the Constitutional Convention. Here we go. Disagreement number 1, state representation in the national government. There are three levels of government in the United States. The federal government is a government that rules over the entire nation. State governments, as you could probably guess, rule over individual states. Local governments rule over cities, towns, townships, etc. At the Constitutional Convention, the first major disagreement was over how states would be represented in the federal or national government. In particular, they were divided over the issue of whether each state should have equal representation in the national legislature or Congress, or if state representation should be based on a state's population. Under the Articles of Confederation government, each state had one representative in the federal government. The problem with this setup is that it ignores the fact that some states have more people than others. States with bigger populations, such as New York, wanted state representation in the national government to be proportional. In other words, these large states wanted to have more representatives, since they had more people. The small states, however, argued that if representation was based on population, they would be shut out of the decision-making process, since they would have fewer votes. As you could guess, the delegates at the convention split over this issue. It ended up being large states versus small states. In the end, they came up with a compromise that is called the Great Compromise. Very creative, I know. Here's what the Great Compromise said. First, it said that there would be two houses or parts to the national legislature or Congress. In one of these houses of Congress, or parts, state representation will be based on population. This House of Congress is called the House of Representatives. Currently, there are 435 members in the House of Representatives. The number of representatives each state sends to the House of Representatives is based on their population. For example, California sends 53 representatives to the House of Representatives. Rhode Island, on the other hand, sends 2 representatives. The more people living in a state, the more people they send to the House. The second House, or part of Congress, is called the Senate. In the Senate, each state has equal representation. There are currently 100 senators in the Senate. Each state sends 2 senators to the Senate regardless of population. The House of Representatives please the larger states, while the Senate pleased the smaller states. Disagreement number 2 involved this question. Do slaves count as part of a state's population? After all, if state representation in the House of Representatives is based on population, a logical question is, do slaves count as part of a state's population? The southern slave states, as you could probably guess, said yes. The northern free states, or states without slavery, said no. Eventually, they reached a very troubling compromise over this issue. They decided that slaves, even though they couldn't vote, and weren't even considered to be citizens, would count as 3/5 of a white person when counting a state's population. We call this uninspiring compromise the 3/5 compromise. Disagreement number 3 also had to do with slavery. Specifically, it concerned the Atlantic slave trade. Most Northerners rightly recognized that the Atlantic slave trade, or the importing of slaves from Africa to the U.S., was completely immoral and had to stop. Southerners, however, were concerned that if the trade ended, the South would gradually lose their slaves over time. The two sides compromised and eventually agreed that the shipping of slaves to the United States from Africa would end in the year 1808. That would give the South 20 years to import more slaves and encourage their own slaves to get married and have children who would then be born into slavery. As you can see, 2 of the 3 issues debated at the Constitutional Convention dealt with the issue of slavery. From the very beginning, slavery was an issue that divided the United States. That division would never completely go away in the years following the convention. Eventually, it will drive the nation to civil war. But that's another topic for another time. Thanks for watching.